Doug. You know, that using LinkedIn is not just necessarily about finding that next immediate job, but it's so useful in terms of finding mentors, clients, etc. So can we go into just more detail about this process? One thing I love about your presentations is that they're always very practical. So I love this process. Please tell us more about it.
Well, I think the first thing in terms of the process, and maybe if we advance to the next slide, because the first part is really focusing on the second degree network. Just as you said, you know, everything I believe in life, whether it's going to be the person you meet who you're going to marry, or the person who is going to be your mentor, or the person who's going to lead you to the next job, most likely it's going to come from your second degree network. And your second degree network is you know, all of the people you know, all of the people who know the people you know. So getting back to the concept of, well, what is the second degree network? And this brings me to this idea or this book, The Tipping Point. And it's funny because the person who first told me about The Tipping Point was Reid Hoffman, the founder or the co-founder of LinkedIn. And I learned about this book and LinkedIn actually from Reid a couple months before the company was founded in 2003. And I found myself at a coffee shop in Mountain View, I think it was Starbucks in Mountain View, where Reid was telling me about this concept in The Tipping Point about the degrees of connection and how certain people are connectors and how the second degree really works. And it was off of that idea that the power of LinkedIn has really been realized. So let's go to the next slide. So starting with this, as a first way to jump into this, let's talk about Lydia. Because when I was first given Lydia as a student by Annabrook, who selected her, I looked at her LinkedIn profile, and I quickly realized that in Lydia's LinkedIn profile, if you look down here, LinkedIn shows you who you have in common. And I noticed that we both had David Ulevich in common. David is actually a good friend, was a client, was the founder of a company that was bought by Cisco and is now a partner at Andreessen Horowitz, and he's a phenomenal guy. We also went to the same university, Washington University. And I thought it was so strange that Lydia, who's a law student, was connected to this guy who's in my first degree network. So I asked her, I said, Lydia, how do you know David Ulevich? And she said, well, Doug, I know David because of, and I have it out here, my college roommate's mom. And this is such and the reason I'm talking about this is such an excellent example of the second degree, right? I mean, Lydia knows her college roommate, and that's in her first degree network. And her college roommate's mom is in her second degree network. Then they become friends. And then Lydia moves to San Francisco, and Lydia's college roommate's mom connects her to David. And David, because he is such a mensch and a great mentor, reaches out and meets with her and talks to her about Silicon Valley as a law student. So that's a great illustration of the second degree network. Next slide. So what you're seeing here is my first degree network. And this is a giant computer rendering of what you really see are each point is a connection. And from this distance, it just looks like clusters. And it actually is clusters. And LinkedIn used to offer this to members. It doesn't anymore because it takes so much computing space that if this was back in the days when LinkedIn didn't have hundreds and hundreds of millions of members. It was a much smaller group. But if you look here, this is a cluster. This group are people who I worked with when I was at LinkedIn. This is another cluster. This is another cluster. And this is me. And this really helps you identify the power of your network. So this is Reid Hoffman's network. And again, this is not confidential. I pulled this off of Google. But you see the beautiful clusters and how these have all been labeled in terms of different companies, or here's Oxford, or groups he's a part of, and how those people interact. Next slide. So the goal of this presentation, unlike prior presentations that I gave at Hastings, where the goal was simply to educate students on how to use LinkedIn, here there's actually a deliverable that we're trying to get to. And that deliverable is to arrive at the top 10, a list of the top 10 people that are most likely to help this student get a job. And you might be saying to yourself, well, how do you get to that? And the way is through my 4-step process. I actually developed a process that should be very, very easy for students. And this process, quite frankly, has been developed over years of me speaking to groups, not just law students, but lawyers at law firms. I was the keynote speaker at the Legal Marketing Association conference one year. And it's kind of been refined over those years to make it as easy as possible.